Hey everybody, Professor Benlin with this second of two videos explaining Unit 4 discussion board. This video will be going over the four topics that you get to choose from. The first topic that you can choose from is Reaganomics, which is what Reagan's economic policy was called. Reagan was sworn into office in January of 1981. His whole goal was to help out Americans because the economy was still suffering from inflation, slow economic growth. He wanted every American to have a little more pocket change to spend. So he put into place tax cuts for the wealthy, stating that the wealth would automatically trickle down to the lower and middle classes if you cut the taxes of the wealthy. Reagan was a huge proponent of smaller government, and he felt that the middle class would definitely benefit from more simplified tax codes. He cut about $41 billion from the federal budget, and unfortunately, a lot of that was for social programs. Supply side economics is also a huge part of Reaganomics. This is the belief that cutting taxes of big businesses will benefit the lower middle classes with the wealth trickling down. The Tax Equity and Responsibility Act, which the article is an interview where Reagan discussed this. This closed tax loopholes and restricts benefits in pension plans. This was Reagan's way of dealing with the nation's debt without having to raise taxes. But it didn't do enough. It helped out somewhat, but didn't raise enough money. The gap between the rich and the poor unquestionably grew during Reagan's years in office. He did not increase the minimum wage the 8 years he was president. Federal funding and funding for firefighters, policemen, and education all cut during his time in office. The hardest hit by Reaganomics were single mother households and African American households. 1984, he further slashed tax rates for the wealthy, causing an even larger federal deficit. Okay, the first Gulf War is your second topic. August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded and took over Kuwait. Kuwait is a very oil-rich nation. President George H.W. Bush was president, and remember, presidents fall into one or two categories, either being very good at domestic policy, very good at foreign policy. Reagan was very good at foreign policy, and so wasn't Bush. Okay, Saudi Arabia allowed United Nations coalition forces into their country to use it as a base. And the United States was the head of the United Nations coalition forces. And the Saudis let these forces into their country and used their country as a base because they were afraid that they were going to be the next target of Iraqi aggression and Iraqi invasion, because they also are a very oil-rich nation. So they said, well, heck, if they just took over Kuwait, we're next. So anyway, and Saddam Hussein had dared to pull this attack because, and engage in this attack and take over Kuwait, because the U.S. had always been an ally of Iraq. But he really did not judge the United States well at all. Coalition forces quickly liberated Kuwait and headed into Iraq. Even though the coalition forces had won the war, Saddam Hussein remained in power. A lot of people criticized former President George H.W. Bush for that. But you have to think of it in this manner, everybody. The Middle East has always been an unstable area of the world. If Saddam Hussein had been ousted from power in 1991, it would have created a power vacuum and would have made an already unstable area of the world even more so. So the document that you're going to analyze in the first Gulf War topic is President George H.W. Bush's speech before the United Nations General Assembly, which occurred on October 1st, 1990. This occurred approximately 2 months after the Iraqi invasion and takeover of Kuwait. Bush openly condemns the Iraqi aggression and calls for members of the United Nations to demand a return of the Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. He says that the United Nations can aid nations to band together to prevent aggression and punish those responsible. The third topic that you can choose from is the rise of conservatism. Pat Buchanan was a Republican conservative commentator that had been a contender for the Republican nomination for president in 1992. Of course, former President George H.W. Bush gained the Republican nomination in 1992. And this speech that Buchanan gave in August 17, 1992, was in support of the re-election campaign of President George H.W. Bush. In this speech, he discusses what he calls a culture war occurring through America. If you're going to analyze this topic, you need to define what the culture war was, what he felt it was. He then states that George H.W. Bush is the right man to lead the nation through its current difficulties. It's interesting. Discuss what topics of debate there were amongst conservatives and liberals then, and are we still debating the same topics today? How have things changed? Are they the same? What have you? Very, very interesting topics, all of these. And there's plenty of research on all of them, research material on all of them. You just need to choose the one that you feel interests you the most. The very last topic that you can choose from is President Ronald Reagan's speech that he gave in 1987, June of 1987, in front of the Berlin Wall. It's famously called the Tear Down This Wall speech. Remember, Reagan was a trained actor, and he was called the Great Communicator, and that is not for nothing. He was a wonderful speech giver, and this is one of his most famous speeches. Reagan gave this speech in front of the Berlin Wall in June of 1987. During the speech, Reagan urged an end to the Cold War and the spread of democracy through those nations that were currently under communist rule. He emphasized the hardships that Berliners had endured since the wall had been built in 1961. The dismantling of the wall occurred 30 years ago, November 1989, with the collapse of the communist East German government. For a while, the East German economy, had been on the decline. Soviet Premier Gorbachev had urged the East Germans to impose economic reforms like perestroika and glasnost, like he did in the Soviet Union, but they did not. Many East Germans were flocking to embassies and wanted to be led into West Germany. November 1989, 30 years ago, leader Erich Honecker resigned and East Germans were let into West Germany. All right, everybody, that is my explanation of the 4 topics that you can choose from. Dive into this, and please do not hesitate to ask me any questions that may arise. Have a good one, everybody.